I was halfway through restocking the canned goods aisle when the bell over the front door jingled. I looked up to see a woman I didn't recognize standing just inside the entrance, glancing around with that particular look people get when they're in an unfamiliar place. She held a folded piece of paper in one hand and kept tucking her hair behind her ear with the other. The new elementary school teacher. I'd heard she arrived in town last week, but this was my first time seeing her in person. She wore a simple blue dress and practical shoes, sensible for someone who'd be on their feet all day with kids. Oscar caught my eye from behind the register and nodded toward her. "Jorge, can you help the lady out? I need to finish these invoices." I set down the can of beans I'd been holding and walked over to her. "Hi there. Can I help you find something?" She looked relieved. "Yes, please. I'm Annie Hansen, the new teacher at Millbrook Elementary. The school gave me this supply list, but I'm not sure where to find half these things." She handed me the paper. "Nice to meet you, Annie. I'm Jorge Stark. Let me show you around." I led her through the store, grabbing items from her list: construction paper, markers, glue sticks, and other classroom supplies. She followed close behind, asking questions about the store layout. "How long have you worked here?" she asked as I reached up to grab a pack of colored pencils from a high shelf. "About 6 years now. My dad worked here when he was my age, too. Henderson's is kind of a family tradition." She smiled. "That's nice. I like towns with traditions." That was my opening. As we walked toward the checkout counter, I cleared my throat. "Speaking of traditions, there are some things about Millbrook you should probably know." "Oh?" She looked interested rather than annoyed, which was a good sign. "Yeah. We have these 5 rules everyone follows. They might sound strange, but they're important." I started ringing up her items while I explained. "Rule 1, never walk in the woods after dark, not even a few steps in." Annie nodded, taking this seriously. "Is it because of wild animals?" "Something like that," I said, not wanting to scare her with too much detail too soon. Rule 2, if you see a white deer, don't move or make any noise until it leaves. "A white deer? Like an albino?" "Exactly. They're rare, but they show up around here more than you'd expect." She looked thoughtful. "That's odd. What's rule 3? If a stranger is too friendly, especially if they smile too much or wave too enthusiastically, avoid them completely." Annie raised her eyebrows. "That seems specific." "Trust me, you'll know it when you see it." Rule 4, if you hear music when there shouldn't be any, go inside immediately and lock your doors and windows. She was watching my face carefully now, trying to figure out if I was joking. I wasn't. "And rule 5, I continued, if you hear someone calling your name from the woods or dark places, never answer, no matter who it sounds like." Annie was quiet for a moment. "These don't sound like ordinary safety precautions." "They're not," I admitted, "but they keep people safe here." What surprised me was what happened next. Instead of laughing or dismissing the rules like most newcomers did, Annie leaned forward. "Where do these rules come from? How long have they existed?" I paused while bagging her supplies. Most people just nodded politely or changed the subject. "They go back generations. My grandfather taught them to my father, who taught them to me." "Have you seen what happens when people break them?" I nodded slowly. "Yes." "All of them?" "Enough to know they're real." She didn't back away or laugh. Instead, she asked more questions. Thoughtful ones about the history of the town, whether the rules were the same in neighboring communities, if they changed over time. I found myself telling her more than I usually shared with newcomers. When I finished ringing up her purchases, I found myself saying, "If you need anything else for the classroom, I can deliver it to the school. Save you a trip." "That's really kind of you, Jorge. I might take you up on that." I carried her bags to the door. As she left, I watched through the window as she walked down the sidewalk. When she came to the corner where the sidewalk ran close to the edge of the woods, she deliberately crossed to the other side of the street, giving the tree line a wide berth, even though it was the middle of the day. "She seems nice," Oscar said, coming up behind me. "Yeah," I agreed, still watching Annie through the window. "Pretty too," Oscar added with a knowing smile. I ignored that comment. She actually listened about the rules. Most newcomers don't. "Let's hope she keeps listening," Oscar said, his tone turning serious. "Remember what happened to the last teacher?" I nodded. The previous elementary school teacher had lasted less than a month before breaking Rule 5. She'd left town the next day, pale and shaking, refusing to tell anyone what she'd heard or seen. "I should check on her in a few days," I said. "Make sure she's still taking the rules seriously." Good idea. As I went back to restocking shelves, I thought about Lance Boyd, the traveling salesman who'd stopped in town last summer. He'd laughed when I told him the rules, called us superstitious country folk, right to my face. 3 days later, they found him at the edge of the woods with spiral markings carved into his skin. The official report said animal attack, but everyone in town knew better. The phone's shrill ring cut through the quiet evening. I had just finished washing dinner dishes and was settling in with a book when the sound startled me. Late calls in Millbrook usually meant trouble. "Hello?" I answered, hearing nothing but shaky breathing on the other end for several seconds. "Jorge?" Annie's voice finally came through, trembling and thin. "Something's wrong. My reflection. It's gone." I gripped the receiver tighter. "What do you mean, gone?" I went to brush my teeth and there's nothing there. The mirror's working fine. I can see the shower behind me, the towel rack, everything, but I'm not there. I'm not in it. Her words tumbled out faster now. I thought maybe it was just that mirror, but I checked the one in my bedroom too. "I'm gone, Jorge." My stomach dropped. "Don't move. Stay away from windows. I'll be right there." I hung up and rushed to my father's room, knocking once before pushing the door open. Dad was still awake, reading in bed with his reading glasses perched on his nose. "It's Annie," I said. Her reflections disappeared. Dad's face changed instantly. He swung his legs off the bed and reached for his shoes. "Thin ground's testing her. Let's go." We took Dad's truck, driving faster than was strictly safe on Millbrook's quiet streets. Neither of us spoke. We both knew what this meant. Newcomers sometimes faced these tests, especially those who got close to families like ours who understood the town's true nature. Annie lived in a small rental house near the elementary school. All the lights were on when we pulled up, blazing from every window like a lighthouse. I reached her front door in 4 quick strides and knocked. "Annie, it's Jorge and my dad." The door opened just enough for her to peer out before she pulled it wider. Annie stood there in sweatpants and an oversized t-shirt, her face pale and drawn. She'd been crying. "Thank you for coming," she whispered, stepping back to let us in. "I know it sounds crazy, but it's not crazy," I assured her, following her inside. "Not in Millbrook." The living room was bright with every lamp turned on. All the curtains were drawn tight, and Annie had even placed a blanket over the window in the front door. She'd gathered pillows and blankets on the couch, creating a small fortress in the center of the room. "I've been sitting here since I called," she said, hugging herself. I didn't know what else to do. Dad moved to one of the covered windows and carefully peeled back the edge of the curtain, just enough to look out. His body went rigid. "Spencer?" I asked. He let the curtain fall back into place. "There's something out there. Shadows moving where they shouldn't be." Annie made a small, frightened sound. "What does it mean?" Dad turned to face us, his expression grave but calm. "It means the thin ground is testing you, Annie. Millbrook sits on what my father called a boundary place, where our world overlaps with something else. New people who learn our rules and start to understand. Sometimes they get noticed." "Noticed by what?" Annie asked. Better not to name it, Dad replied. But we'll stay with you tonight. By morning, this should pass. I moved to Annie's side, placing a hand on her shoulder. We won't leave you alone. She nodded gratefully, some of the tension leaving her body. We settled in for a long night. Dad took the armchair near the front window, periodically checking outside. I sat beside Annie on the couch. None of us felt like sleeping. Want to check the mirror again? I asked after an hour had passed. Annie shook her head. Not yet. I'm scared of what I might not see. Around 2 a.m, we heard scratching at the back door. Not like an animal trying to get in. More deliberate, almost like fingernails dragging slowly across the wood. Dad and I exchanged looks. Annie pulled her knees to her chest. Don't open it, Dad said unnecessarily. Don't even acknowledge it. The scratching continued for nearly 20 minutes before stopping abruptly. At 4, the lights flickered 3 times but stayed on. Annie reached for my hand and held it tightly. Tell me something normal, she whispered. Something that has nothing to do with any of this. I thought for a moment. When I was 10, I decided the store needed a pet cat to catch mice. I found a stray kitten and hid it in the storage room for 3 days, before Oscar discovered it had shredded an entire case of paper towels. Annie's laugh was small but genuine. Did you get to keep it? No, but Mrs. Winters down the street took him in. Named him Shredder. We traded stories through the night, keeping our voices low. Dad remained vigilant, checking windows periodically and reporting that the shadows still moved in patterns that didn't match any light source. Finally, the first gray light of dawn filtered through the edges of the curtains. Dad stood and stretched. Sunrise, he said. Annie, would you like to check now? Annie hesitated, then nodded. I walked with her to the bathroom, waiting outside the door. Jorge, she called after a moment, her voice lifting with relief. I'm back. When she emerged, color had returned to her face. It's normal again. I can see myself. Dad was already in the kitchen when we returned. The shadows are gone too, he reported. You made it through, Annie. What happens now? She asked. Now we eat breakfast, Dad said practically. You got eggs? While Dad cooked, Annie sat at her small kitchen table, looking exhausted but relieved. I made coffee, moving around her kitchen with growing familiarity. I should tell you something, Annie said quietly as I set a mug in front of her. Last week, I almost broke Rule 2. I paused. The white deer? She nodded. I was supervising recess and saw one at the edge of the playground. I started walking toward it. I don't even know why. Then I remembered what you told me and stopped. It watched me for a minute, then disappeared back into the trees. You did the right thing, I said, feeling a wave of protectiveness. The rules matter, Annie. They keep people safe. I know that now, she said, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. I really know. Dad set plates of scrambled eggs in front of us. The Thompson family, Jorge's mother's side, they've been keeping these rules alive for generations. My father-in-law made sure I understood them when I married into the family. I want to learn more, Annie said, about the town, the rules, all of it. I'll teach you, I promised, everything I know. After breakfast, with sunlight now streaming through the windows, the night's events felt almost dreamlike. But the serious look in my father's eyes reminded me it had been very real. We helped Annie clean up, and I made sure she felt safe staying in the house alone. Call if anything else happens, I told her. Anything at all. I will, she said, looking steadier now. Thank you both for coming. Outside, as we walked toward Dad's truck, I spotted someone watching us from across the street. Roger Ford stood on the sidewalk, smiling broadly. When he saw me notice him, his smile widened even further. Too wide, too eager, and he waved with exaggerated enthusiasm. Rule 3 flashed in my mind. Avoid overly friendly strangers who smile or wave too much. I grabbed Dad's arm and steered him toward the truck. "Let's go, now." "What is it?" Dad asked, then followed my gaze. His expression hardened. "Get in the truck, Jorge." Ford kept waving, his smile fixed and unnatural as we pulled away from the curb. I got off the phone with Sheriff Barry, my hand still shaking a little. I had just finished telling her everything about Roger Ford, the way he smiled too wide, how he waved with that unnatural enthusiasm, and most importantly, how he perfectly fit the description of Rule 3. Avoid overly friendly strangers who smile or wave too much. "I know it sounds strange," I said before hanging up, "but in Millbrook, these things matter." Sheriff Barry had listened carefully, taking notes without judgment. She promised to look into Ford's background, though I could tell she was being professional rather than truly believing my concerns about the rules. 3 days later, my phone rang while I was restocking the fishing tackle display at Henderson's. "Jorge, Jade Barry here. You were right about Ford." I stepped away from the display, lowering my voice even though no customers were nearby. "Right how?" "His real name is William Brennan. He's wanted in 3 counties across Montana and Idaho for running confidence schemes on elderly residents. Apparently, he moves into small towns, gets friendly with vulnerable seniors, and then cleans out their bank accounts." A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the store's air conditioning. "Has he hurt anyone here?" "Not yet. We picked him up this morning. Found fake IDs, credit card skimmers, and documentation on at least 4 of our older residents. You might have saved Mrs. Holloway from losing her life savings." After hanging up, I leaned against the counter, relief washing over me. The rules had protected us again. This time it wasn't anything supernatural, just a garden-variety criminal, but Rule 3 had still kept us safe. Oscar noticed my expression and raised an eyebrow. "That con artist, Ford, or Brennan actually, Sheriff Barry just arrested him." Oscar nodded, unsurprised. "The rules don't distinguish between human predators and the other kind. They just keep us safe." I spent the rest of my shift feeling validated. The other employees had noticed Ford's excessive friendliness too, but I was the one who took it seriously enough to call the sheriff. Maybe I really was growing into my role as a guardian of Millbrook's traditions. My satisfaction lasted exactly 4 hours and 26 minutes. I was helping a customer find canning supplies when my phone vibrated. Annie's name flashed on the screen and something in my gut tightened. "Jorge." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "There's a white deer near the playground. I'm following Rule 2, but some of the kids are getting restless. How long do I need to stay still?" My heart jumped to my throat. "Don't move, I'm on my way." I quickly explained the situation to Oscar, who immediately waved me out the door. "Go. White deer don't show up by accident." I drove to the elementary school faster than was strictly legal, parking haphazardly in the fire lane. The playground was visible from the parking lot, a flat expanse of equipment and wood chips bordered by the beginning of the forest that surrounded most of Millbrook. Annie stood at the edge of the playground, her body completely rigid. About 20 feet away, a magnificent white deer grazed peacefully on the grass between the playground and the tree line. Its coat wasn't the dingy off-white of an albino, but a pure, luminous white that seemed to glow even in the afternoon sunlight. I approached slowly, careful not to make sudden movements or sounds. When I reached Annie, I whispered, "Where are the kids?" "Inside," she breathed back, barely moving her lips. "I told the assistant teacher to take them in for an early art period." Smart woman. I stood beside her, adopting the same frozen posture, and we watched the deer together. It was larger than normal deer, its antlers spreading in an impressive rack that seemed to catch the light in unusual ways. "How long has it been here?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "About 20 minutes before I called you." We remained there, completely motionless for what felt like forever. My back began to ache, My legs grew stiff, but I didn't dare move. The white deer occasionally looked up at us, its dark eyes seeming almost knowing, before returning to its grazing. Nearly an hour passed before the deer finally lifted its head, gazed at us for one long moment, and then turned and walked unhurriedly into the forest, disappearing among the trees. Annie let out a long breath and sagged against me. My legs are killing me. I put an arm around her shoulders. You did exactly right. That's not a normal deer. I gathered that. She rubbed her calves. What would have happened if I'd moved? I don't know specifically, I admitted, but nothing good. That evening, I took Annie to meet Josephine Knapp, one of our town elders who knew more about Millbrook's history and rules than anyone else alive. Josephine lived in a small house near the town center, its walls lined with books and strange artifacts collected over her 70 years. A white deer at the school, Josephine said, pouring tea for us. That's significant. It's watching. Testing. Testing what? Annie asked. You, Josephine said simply. Newcomers who learn the rules sometimes attract attention. I leaned forward. Annie followed Rule 2 perfectly. She didn't move until the deer left. Josephine nodded approvingly. Good. Your Uncle Jeff wasn't so wise. This was news to me. Uncle Jeff saw a white deer? 15 years ago. He was hunting out of season, saw a white deer, and shot at it. Josephine shook her head. He missed, thankfully, or things would have been even worse. What happened to him? Annie asked. Josephine sipped her tea. First, his truck broke down on the way home. Then his house caught fire, not enough to destroy it, just enough to make it unlivable for months. His dog ran away. He lost his job when the lumber mill closed unexpectedly. Finally, he fell and broke his leg in 3 places while repairing his roof. I remembered some of this, but I'd been only 14 when Uncle Jeff left town. I hadn't connected it to the rules. After the leg, he left Millbrook, Josephine continued, said the town was cursed. I tried to explain he'd brought it on himself by disturbing the white deer, but he wouldn't listen. We thanked Josephine for the information and left as darkness fell. I suggested dinner at the diner, and Annie agreed. The meal was comfortable, both of us processing what we'd learned from Josephine. It was fully dark when we left the diner. The walk to Annie's rental house wasn't long, just 4 blocks through the center of town before reaching the residential area near the school. The night was clear, stars visible above the streetlights, and the air had that early autumn crispness that made walking pleasant. We were passing the gap between the hardware store and the old post office building when I heard it. Jorge. I froze mid-step. The voice had come from the darkness between the buildings, a voice I recognized instantly despite not having heard it in 15 years. Jorge, I need your help. It was my grandfather Roger's voice, exactly as I remembered it. The slight gravel, the particular way he pronounced my name with the emphasis on the first syllable. But my grandfather had been dead for 15 years. Jorge, please, I'm hurt. Annie's hand clamped around my arm, her fingers digging in. Rule 5, she whispered urgently. Don't answer. The voice came again, more insistent. Jorge, I know you can hear me. Why won't you help me? Every instinct in my body screamed to respond, to help the voice that sounded exactly like my grandfather. My mouth opened, words forming on my tongue. Annie's grip tightened painfully. It's not him, she hissed. Remember Rule 5. We started walking again, faster now, away from the voice. But it followed us, seeming to move from shadow to shadow along our route. Jorge, why are you ignoring me? Jorge. The voice grew angry, the familiar tones of my grandfather twisting into something else, something with an edge that made my skin crawl. Jorge, answer me! Annie pulled me along, practically running now. I felt a pressure building in my head, an overwhelming compulsion to turn around, to answer the voice, to help my grandfather. The urge was almost physical, like hands pushing against my back. "Almost to my house," Annie panted. "Don't look back, don't answer." The voice continued calling, each repetition of my name more distorted and angry than the last. Without Annie's presence, I'm not sure I could have resisted the urge to respond. My name followed me everywhere. For 3 straight nights, it floated through the darkness, calling with Grandfather Roger's voice. I heard it from the woods behind Henderson's, from the alley beside the post office, even from the empty lot across from my house. "Jorge," it would whisper, sounding exactly like him. "Jorge, I need you." Each time I walked faster, clenching my jaw against the urge to answer. My skin crawled with the knowledge that something was watching me, waiting for me to break Rule 5. On the 3rd night, I barely slept. I lay awake listening for my name, jumping at every creak of the old house. When morning finally came, I stumbled into the kitchen to find Dad already at the table, dark circles under his eyes. "You heard it again last night," he said, not a question. I nodded, pouring coffee into the largest mug we owned. 3 nights in a row now. Always sounds like Grandpa Roger. Dad stared into his own cup. "When I was about your age, I went through the same thing. For me, it was my brother's voice. He died when we were kids." He looked up at me, went on for nearly 2 weeks. 2 weeks? The thought of enduring this for 11 more days made my stomach turn. "How did you make it stop?" "I didn't. It just ended. Your grandfather said I passed some kind of test." I was about to ask more when my phone buzzed with a text from Oscar asking if I'd be late. I grabbed my jacket and keys, promising Dad we'd talk more later. The morning at Henderson's passed in a blur. I kept checking my phone, half expecting Annie to report some new strangeness. Around noon, I was restocking the freezer section when I heard it. "Jorge!" The voice came from behind the ice cream display. "Jorge, help me!" I dropped the box of frozen peas I was holding. The voice, in broad daylight. I glanced around wildly, but the only other person in the aisle was Mrs. Holloway examining frozen dinners. "Did you hear that?" I asked her. She looked up, confused. "Hear what, dear?" The voice came again, this time from the back storeroom. "Jorge, please." I backed away, bumping into a display of cereal boxes. Oscar appeared from behind the counter, frowning at me. "Everything okay?" I shook my head slightly, not wanting to frighten customers. "It's happening during the day now." Understanding dawned on his face. He nodded toward the door. "Go see Josephine. I'll cover here." 20 minutes later, I sat in Josephine Knapp's cluttered living room, hands wrapped around a mug of tea I hadn't touched. I just finished explaining everything. The voice, how it now followed me in daylight, how perfectly it mimicked my grandfather. Josephine listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding as if confirming something she already knew. When I finished, she set down her own tea and leaned forward. "Millbrook isn't like other places, Jorge. We sit on what my grandmother called thin ground, a place where our world overlaps with something else." "Something else?" I repeated. "I don't have a better name for it. No one does. But it's been here longer than the town, longer than any of us." She adjusted her glasses. "The rules exist because people noticed patterns, what attracted attention from the other side, and what kept us safe." I thought about Annie's missing reflection, the white deer, the unnatural shadows. Why is this happening to me specifically? "Because you're a Thompson," she said simply. "On your mother's side. The Thompson family has served as guardians of Millbrook for generations. Your grandfather did it. Your father did it for a while. Now it's testing you." "Testing me for what?" "To see if you'll uphold the rules, to see if you'll protect the town." She reached out and patted my hand. The calling of your name will continue until you're accepted or until you break. I drove home with Josephine's words echoing in my head. When I got there, I called Annie and asked her to meet me at the house. Dad was already home, and I filled them both in on what Josephine had told me. "So, what do we do?" Annie asked. "Just wait it out?" I shook my head. "I don't think waiting is the answer. If this is a test, maybe I need to prove something." Dad looked at me carefully. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking we need to gather everyone, the whole town." I stood up, suddenly certain. If this is about protecting Millbrook, then let's make it official. The next day, Sheriff Barry helped us spread the word. By 7 that evening, the community center was packed with nearly every resident of Millbrook. People sat in folding chairs, stood along the walls, whispered to each other about why they'd been called. I recognized faces from Henderson's, the diner, the hardware store, people who'd lived here all their lives alongside newcomers who'd arrived in recent years. Annie sat in the front row next to Dad. Josephine was there too, nodding encouragingly. Sheriff Barry stood by the door, arms crossed. Oscar had closed the store early to attend. As I walked to the front of the room, the murmuring died down. I cleared my throat, suddenly aware of how quiet it had become. "Thank you all for coming," I began. "Most of you know me. I'm Jorge Stark. I work at Henderson's. My family has been in Millbrook for generations." I paused, looking out at the sea of faces. We all know Millbrook has rules. They might seem strange to outsiders or newcomers, but they keep us safe. Tonight I want to make these rules clear for everyone. As I spoke those words, the temperature in the room dropped noticeably. Several people pulled their jackets tighter, looking around in confusion. I continued anyway. Rule number 1, never walk in the woods after dark. The lights flickered briefly. On the wall behind me, shadows began to move in ways that didn't match the people casting them. Rule number 2, if you see a white deer, don't move or make noise until it leaves. The cold intensified. I could see my breath now, forming clouds in front of my face. Annie's eyes widened, but she gave me a small nod to continue. Rule number 3, avoid overly friendly strangers who smile or wave too much. A pressure began building in the room, not physical, but something I felt in my mind, pushing against my thoughts, trying to make me stop talking. Several people near the back stood up as if to leave, then sat back down, looking confused. Rule number 4, if you hear unexplained music, go inside and lock your doors and windows. The shadows on the walls grew darker, stretching into impossible shapes. One formed what looked like a hand reaching toward me. I felt sweat breaking out on my forehead despite the cold. Rule number 5, I said, my voice growing stronger, despite the pressure trying to silence me. Never answer if someone calls your name from the woods or dark places. As I said the final rule, I heard it, my name, whispered from every corner of the room at once. "Jorge," came Grandfather Roger's voice, though his tone had changed. It was angry now, threatening. The pressure in my head became almost unbearable. The shadows writhed on the walls. People gasped, some covering their ears as if they could hear it too. But I didn't stop. I looked out at my neighbors, my community, and continued. These rules aren't superstitions. They're not small-town paranoia. They're our protection against something that's been here longer than Millbrook itself, something that tests us, that watches us. The voice grew louder, competing with my words. The shadows stretched toward me from all sides. My family has helped keep these rules alive for generations. The Thompsons have been unofficial guardians of this knowledge. But these rules belong to all of us. They protect all of us, and we all need to follow them. I finished reciting the 5 rules to the gathered townspeople when I felt the supernatural pressure suddenly release. It was like a physical weight lifting from my shoulders. One moment I was straining against an invisible force, and the next I could breathe freely again. The voice that had been calling my name, the one that sounded so much like my grandfather Roger, made a sound I'll never forget. It was like wind rushing through broken glass, high-pitched and jagged, before fading away completely. The sound seemed to sweep through the community center and then out into the night. I watched as the shadows that had been stretching toward me, twisting into impossible shapes on the walls, gradually settled back into normal patterns. The room temperature, which had dropped so dramatically that people were huddled in their jackets with visible breath, began to warm. I could feel the change spreading through the room as people straightened in their chairs and loosened their scarves. Josephine Knapp rose from her seat near the front. Her eyes met mine, and she gave me a firm nod before turning to address the crowd. "The test has passed," she announced, her voice carrying clearly through the now quiet room. "What you've witnessed tonight is proof of what the Thompson family has protected us from for generations." As people began to file out, several of the older residents approached me. Mrs. Holloway, who must have been in her 80s, took my hand between both of hers. "Your grandfather would be proud," she told me. "Thank you for continuing the Thompson tradition." Mr. Peterson, who owned the hardware store, clapped me on the shoulder. "Your mother's family has kept this town safe longer than any of us have been alive," he said. "Good to see you stepping up." I hadn't expected this reaction. I'd been so focused on getting through my speech, on fighting against whatever was trying to stop me, that I hadn't considered what would come after. The acknowledgement felt both strange and right. Dad waited until most people had left before approaching me. He didn't say anything, just pulled me into a brief, tight hug. When he stepped back, I could see moisture in his eyes. Annie was the last to approach. She'd stayed seated while others filed out, watching the interactions with a small smile. "That was something else," she said, standing to join me. "Are you okay?" "Yeah," I said, surprised to find it was true. Better than I've been in weeks, actually. We walked out of the community center together. Outside, the night air felt different. I paused at the bottom of the steps, looking toward the edge of town where the forest began. The woods had seemed menacing for as long as I could remember, especially at night. There was always a sense that something was watching, waiting. But now, the trees stood quiet and still, no longer projecting that feeling of malice toward the town. "The woods seem different," Annie said, following my gaze. "You feel it too?" I asked. "Less angry," she said, searching for the right word. "Like whatever was there has backed off." Dad drove us home, and for the first time in weeks, I went to bed without dreading what I might hear in the darkness. No whispers came from the corners of my room. No voice called my name from outside my window. I slept deeply and dreamlessly until morning light filtered through my curtains. When I made my way to the kitchen, Dad was already gone. He'd left a note saying he'd headed out early to help the Wilsons with a plumbing issue. I made a quick breakfast and headed to Henderson's, arriving earlier than usual. I was surprised to find Oscar already there, along with several other townspeople who normally wouldn't show up until later in the day. Oscar was brewing a pot of coffee behind the counter, while Mrs. Peterson and the Franklin brothers sat at the small table we kept near the window. "Morning," I said, hanging my jacket on the hook by the door. "There he is," Oscar said, looking up with a grin. "Sleep well?" "Actually, yeah. Better than I have in a while." "Same here," Mrs. Peterson said. First night in weeks I didn't wake up to strange noises outside my window. The Franklin brothers nodded in agreement. "Whole town slept better last night," Oscar said, pouring coffee into mugs. "Sheriff Barry called this morning, said the night shift was the quietest it's been all year. Not a single call about strange sounds or shadows." As I helped Oscar open the store, more people dropped by, all with similar stories. They'd slept peacefully. The strange occurrences that had been plaguing Millbrook, unexplained knocking, whispers from empty rooms, shadows moving against the light, had stopped. I was restocking the front display when Annie pushed through the door, carrying 2 coffee cups from the diner down the street. "Thought you might need this," she said, handing me one, though it looks like Oscar beat me to it. "More coffee is always welcome," I said, taking the cup gratefully. We moved to a quiet corner of the store while Oscar helped a customer. "I've been thinking," Annie said, her voice low. "What you did last night was important, but there's something else we should do." "What's that?" "Document the rules properly for future generations." She looked at me intently. "Your grandfather passed them to your father, who passed them to you, but what if we created a formal record? Something that explains not just the rules, but why they matter, what happens when they're broken. Real examples like your Uncle Jeff and the white deer." I considered her suggestion. The Thompson family had always passed the rules down orally, from one generation to the next, but Annie was right. A written record would ensure nothing was lost or forgotten. "That's a good idea," I said. "We could talk to Josephine, see if she knows more about the history, and there might be other families in town with stories we don't know about." Annie smiled, clearly pleased I'd agreed with her suggestion. "I think it's important," she said. "These rules have protected Millbrook for generations. They should be preserved." I nodded, feeling the weight of my family's legacy settle more comfortably on my shoulders. I'd truly inherited the role of guardian, not just of the rules themselves, but of the town's safety. And for the first time, that responsibility didn't feel like a burden. It felt right. I spent the next several months working with Annie and Josephine to document Millbrook's 5 rules. What started as a simple project grew into something much more meaningful than I'd expected. We established a routine: Tuesday and Thursday evenings at Josephine's house, surrounded by her collection of local artifacts and historical records, and Saturday mornings interviewing town elders. Annie brought a teachers' organization to our efforts. She created files for each rule, subcategorized by decades, with cross-references to specific incidents. Her kitchen table disappeared under stacks of notes and recordings. I'd never seen someone take to Millbrook's peculiarities with such dedication. "These stories need to be preserved properly," she told me one evening as we walked back from interviewing Mrs. Holloway, who'd shared a harrowing account of music playing from empty fields in 1972, not just for newcomers, but for the children born here, who might take the rules for granted. The oldest residents opened up to us in ways that surprised me. Mr. Finch, at 93, the oldest person in town, invited us into his living room filled with black and white photos dating back to when Millbrook was just a cluster of buildings around a sawmill. "My grandmother saw the white deer 7 times in her life," he told us, voice cracking with age but eyes sharp with memory. "Said it was always before something big happened. Last time was 3 days before the mill fire of 1938. Each interview revealed patterns I'd never noticed growing up. The supernatural tests came in cycles, intensifying every few decades before subsiding again. The most recent uptick had started around the time I took over at Henderson's, culminating in my public recitation of the rules. Josephine's contribution proved most surprising. On a cool autumn day, she led us to a series of caves in the hillside beyond the North Woods, accessible only by a narrow trail that wound between ancient oak trees. "The Thompson family weren't the first guardians," she explained as we followed her surprisingly spry pace up the path. "They were simply the ones who understood the importance of maintaining the knowledge." Inside the main cave, she shined her flashlight on a series of markings etched into the stone wall. The symbols looked nothing like English, yet contained distinct patterns that repeated in 5 separate groupings. "These date back at least 500 years, Josephine said, "made by people who lived here long before Millbrook existed." Annie traced the symbols with her fingertips. "And they match our 5 rules?" "Almost exactly," Josephine confirmed. "The first grouping warns of darkness beyond the trees. The second speaks of white messengers that must be honored. The third describes false friends with empty smiles. The fourth mentions songs that shouldn't be heard. And the fifth... She paused, her flashlight illuminating the final set of symbols. The fifth warns never to answer when the voices call your name. I took photos of the markings to include in our documentation, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the cave's temperature. Whatever watched over Millbrook had been here long before any of us. The most personal discovery came when Dad brought down a box of Grandpa Roger's belongings from our attic. Inside, wrapped in faded cloth, we found 5 leather-bound journals spanning from 1962 until his death. I never knew he kept these, Dad said, handling them carefully. He was always private about his role as guardian. The journals detailed every supernatural occurrence Grandpa Roger had witnessed or been told about. White deer sightings, mysterious music, voices calling from the woods, shadows that moved against the light, all documented with dates, times, and outcomes. He'd also recorded the names of those who broke the rules and what happened to them afterward. Most fascinating were his entries about my Uncle Jeff. Grandpa had tried repeatedly to warn Jeff about the consequences of his actions, only to be dismissed as superstitious. The entry from the day after Jeff shot at the white deer was particularly heartbreaking. My son has challenged what should not be challenged. I fear for what comes next. Annie and I grew closer through our work. The shared purpose brought us together in a way ordinary dating never could have. We spent evenings reading Grandpa's journals aloud to each other or comparing notes from our interviews. Sometimes we'd stay up talking until dawn about what it all meant, the thin ground, the ancient presence, our place in it all. One rainy Sunday in April, as we sorted through photos of the cave markings at her kitchen table, Annie looked up at me. "I've been thinking," she said, tucking her hair behind her ear the way she had that first day in Henderson's. "My lease is up next month, and we're spending almost every night together anyway." I felt a smile spread across my face. "Are you asking to move in with me?" "Only if you're asking me to," she replied with a matching smile. 2 weeks later, we moved her things into my house. Dad helped carry boxes, commenting only once that my mother would have liked Annie. Coming from him, it was the highest compliment possible. We settled into a comfortable routine. Mornings at Henderson's for me, school days for Annie, evenings spent completing our documentation project. The supernatural incidents around town had quieted since my public recitation of the rules, but we knew from Grandpa's journals that such periods of calm were temporary. "The town needs to be ready when the testing returns," I explained to Oscar one morning while restocking the bread aisle. "And newcomers need to understand these aren't just small-town superstitions." Oscar nodded sagely. "Your grandfather would be proud. He always worried what would happen when he was gone." On a warm evening in early June, Annie and I walked home from dinner at the diner. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across Main Street as we turned onto the residential road leading to our house. We were discussing plans to present our completed documentation to the town council when Annie suddenly gripped my arm. "Jorge," she whispered, nodding toward the tree line ahead. There, at the edge of the woods where our street met the forest, stood a white deer. Larger than a normal deer, its coat gleamed with an inner light that seemed to pulse gently in the fading daylight. Its antlers branched impressively above its head, more points than I'd ever seen. Remembering Rule 2, we both froze in place. I could feel Annie's hand tightening on my arm as the deer regarded us with unnaturally intelligent eyes. For several minutes, we stood motionless as the deer watched us. Then, to my astonishment, it began walking toward us. In all the stories I'd heard, in all of Grandpa's journals, the white deer had never approached humans directly. The deer stopped just a few feet away, its eyes, dark and knowing, fixed on mine. Then it lowered its head and stepped forward again, stretching its nose toward my hand. I remained perfectly still as the deer's soft muzzle touched my skin, its warm breath ghosting across my fingers. The contact lasted only seconds before the deer pulled back, gave what almost looked like a nod, and turned unhurriedly back toward the woods. We watched in silence as it disappeared among the trees, its white coat visible through gaps in the foliage until it vanished completely. "What just happened?" Annie whispered, still not moving. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I think we need to tell Josephine." The next day, we recounted the experience to Josephine in her living room. She listened intently, her eyes widening when I described the deer touching my hand. "In all the records I've studied, in all the stories passed down through generations," she said slowly, "there's never been an account of the white deer making physical contact with a person. It's always observed from a distance, testing but never touching." "What does it mean?" Annie asked. Josephine looked at me with something like reverence. "It means acceptance. The guardian of the thin ground has acknowledged Jorge as Millbrook's protector." Word spread quickly through town. People stopped me on the street to ask about the white deer, some offering congratulations as if I'd achieved something remarkable. Mrs. Holloway brought a homemade pie to Henderson's. Sheriff Barry nodded respectfully when our paths crossed outside the post office. Even Dad seemed to stand a little straighter, as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The town council accepted our documentation project with unanimous approval. They allocated funds to print copies for the library, school, and town hall, ensuring the knowledge would be preserved and accessible. Mayor Wilson formally recognized Annie and me as the keepers of Millbrook's traditions, a title that had never officially existed but everyone understood. On the first day, the printed copies were available. I hung a framed version of the 5 rules on the wall near Henderson's entrance, where newcomers would see them immediately upon entering. Oscar helped me position it just right, stepping back to admire our work. "Perfect spot," he said. "Your grandfather used to stand right there and recite them to every new face that walked in." I ran my fingers along the frame, feeling a connection to Grandpa Roger and all the Thompsons before him who had protected Millbrook. For the first time, I felt completely at peace with my role as guardian. The responsibility that had once seemed so burdensome now felt right, like a coat that finally fit properly. That evening, Annie and I sat on our front porch watching fireflies appear in the gathering dusk. The woods at the edge of town stood quiet and still, neither threatening nor inviting, simply present as they had been for centuries before Millbrook existed. "Do you ever wonder what it is?" Annie asked, her head resting on my shoulder. "What lives in the thin ground?" "Sometimes," I admitted. "But Grandpa wrote that understanding it isn't as important as respecting it." Annie nodded thoughtfully. "I like being part of this, part of the tradition." I squeezed her hand, thinking of all the Thompsons who had carried this responsibility before me, and now of Annie sharing it with me. The legacy of protection continued, strengthened by our documentation and the town's renewed awareness of the rules.